Good evening, and welcome to Global Trotters. Welcome. I'm your host, Bo Hosking, and today we'll be talking about foreign aid in Africa. As many people know, Africa is a struggling continent. It is known for its poor economy and reliance on stronger nations to keep it above water. Out of the top 25 countries with the highest portion of GDP as foreign aid, 16 are in Africa. The per capita income is roughly $1, and less than 2/3 of the population can read. Today on our show, we have a number of correspondents reporting that will dissect Africa's foreign aid and observe the history as well as its positive and negative aspects. Joining me now is correspondent Victoria Holt to talk about the origins of aid. So Victoria, why did aid arise and how has it changed over the course of its existence?
It's good to be back, Bo. Financial aid began in the early 1940s after the end of the Second World War with the Bretton Woods Conference. The United States was primarily interested in fixing international finances and improving trade among global nations. After the Marshall Plan was put in place, Europe's economies fixed themselves and our attention was moved to Africa. Several newly independent nations left African countries in economic shambles. Then the Cold War began. The US and the USSR both used aid to spread communism and capitalism as means of fighting during the war. After the war was over, we brought focus to railroads, roads, and other centers for transportation and communication. With the come of the 1980s, we realized that government may be a reason for the economic problems in Africa. We tried to solve these with two steps. First, stabilization was used to solve immediate problems such as poverty rates and unemployment. Then we used structural adjustments to make long-term changes in these countries to help their economies stay stable for long periods of time. In the 1990s, a controversy spread, and people were questioning whether American aid was actually efficient or not. Also, the idea of democracy to solve economic problems was put in place. This proved ineffective, however, because many African countries were not fit to take a democracy and therefore were not helped by our imposing of government. Nowadays, aid is continued to be given to countries in Africa, but it has continued to be questioned whether this aid is actually efficient or not.
Can you give me an example of aid working?
After World War II, several nations in Europe were doing financially horrible because of all the money that they had spent during the war, and they were highly in debt. Marshall came up with a plan known as the Marshall Plan, where the United States gave financial aid to several of these European nations over a 4-year period so that they could rebuild their economies. This form of aid was known to be successful because of the time constraint on it. The money was given in increments over a 4-year period of time, which gave the countries a set plan to rebuild themselves. Foreign aid that's given today is seen as less productive because it doesn't have a timeline and it's just given continuously, so therefore nations see it as revenue rather than limited aid, so they start to depend on it more.
200,000 African children under the age of 5 die every week. Almost half of the world, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. For just a few dollars, you can improve the life of a child in need. Lend a helping hand. Everyone can help.
Welcome back to Global Trotters. Alongside me I have Carrie, an expert on foreign aid. Carrie, a lot of people don't understand exactly what foreign aid and what it does. Can you give us a little background on it?
Yeah, sure. There are two types of foreign aid. Generally you can have humanitarian aid, which is like an emergency response, and then you can have developmental aid, which is also known as official development assistance. Now, there are two ways that this aid can be distributed: through non-governmental organizations, which are also called NGOs, and through official government agencies. Humanitarian aid is generally administered through both NGOs and official government agencies, whereas development aid is more generally from government assistance. Now, often the line between them is blurred, so that can mean that humanitarian can also overlap into development aid, which complicate things in terms of distribution.
So what's the distinction between humanitarian and developmental aid?
So humanitarian aid, like I said before, has to do with emergency aid. So what that means is that it's generally used for natural disasters, such as in the 2010 earthquake with Haiti. Now, in that example, around $15 billion was donated as a humanitarian response. Of that $15 billion, around $4 billion was donated from NGOs. And then another $1 billion was donated by USAID, which is a major U.S. government assistance aid program. And then another $1 billion was donated from the U.S. for future development. The rest were from other countries and world organizations. Now, developmental aid is meant to be more long-term, and it's meant to be a more sustainable form of aid, which is supposed to help develop the social, economic, and political status of a country. So, like in the case of Haiti, we also donated, like I said, $1 billion for future development. Now, what that's supposed to do is help build infrastructure, educational programs, and also the future development of a country. But what we've seen is that that's not always the case. One of the major issues about aid today is that it might actually be more detrimental in terms of long-term aid because it can be seen as a source of income, not as a source of a boost to help get a country back on its feet.
So how does U.S. aid compare to that of foreign countries such as France or the United Kingdom, or even of the United Nations?
Well, that's an interesting question because what you have with government aid is you can have bilateral or multilateral aid. And what that means is that bilateral means that the aid is transferred between only two countries, which is, for example, the U.S. directly to a country like Zambia. Now, when you have multilateral aid, that means that the resources are first transferred to a central organization such as the World Bank or something of that nature, and then those resources are distributed. So what that means is that often you have multiple countries contributing to the same organization, to the same cause. Now when you have bilateral aid, which is what I mentioned before, only two countries, you see a lot of political motivation and in some cases political corruption. In multilateral aid, however, we see, like with the World Bank and the IMF.
And this brings us to our next question. What motivates people, organizations, and countries to provide aid for other nations? Here with us, standing by, we have Chang-En, expert analyst, who will help answer these questions for us.
Well, Bo, there are two main reasons. One is of morality, which we say could be said of charity, or one is responsibility. NGOs consider their motive to be charity. They don't believe they own anyone to donate, but they believe that is the right thing to do. While governments and individuals feel they have the responsibilities to donate to these poorer countries. So the utilitarians believe that if we could give someone happiness without substantially decreasing our own, it's worth it. So if I have 10 happiness points and you have 1, and I donate 1 point to you, you just doubled your happiness while I lost almost nothing. So in this process, you increase your happiness substantially, but I lost almost nothing. Now, this system breaks down when I give you 1 happiness, but in return you receive half a happiness, or maybe 10th or 100th. So is it worth it anymore? And this approach fails in that aspect. The fight for human rights has also led to the existence of foreign aid. Declared in Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, people have the right to economic, social, and cultural rights, and poverty has been universally recognized as a barrier to these basic human rights by the UN. Other reasons come from the responsibility for past perpetuation of suffering, such as the colonization of Africa by the Europeans. These European countries feel that they have a responsibility to help out these African countries because of their past interactions.
And now we go to the East African country of Malawi, where we have Chief Correspondent Emery on the scene to talk to us. Emery, how effective is foreign aid?
Here we are live from Malawi. What's that, Bo? I can't hear you over the screams of poverty. Just kidding, folks. Alright, now, your question was about the effectiveness of foreign aid. In general, foreign aid has been historically ineffective due to a variety of factors, including unfocused funding, inadequate distribution of aid, cultural boundaries, and of course, corrupt government involvement. Now, The larger the scope of the aid project, the greater the number of employees that are being used and are being paid, and thus the greater the quantity of materials that need to be purchased to sustain the organization. Ultimately, the amount of aid that is actually received by the communities is significantly less than the amount invested to help them, due to employee paychecks, material costs, and other issues that need to be dealt with. In fact, the majority share of aid resources never leaves the donor country, leading to further degradation within already inefficient state bureaucracies. Back to you, Bo.
Mm-hmm. And how do the natives of these countries take the foreign aid?
Yeah? Okay, how is the aid received by the community? Well, once the aid is actually received by the community, there are, usually mixed reactions. Often the aid is not equally dispersed amongst the people, creating social fissures and unrest amongst community members who do not actually receive the aid. For example, specifically just last year, CARE, C-A-R-E, a foreign aid program, attempted to provide efficient stoves to a small community in Ilapo. Unfortunately, they failed to account for the social circumstances of the community. The community was divided by a river, and CARE only delivered the stoves to half the community, which created jealousy on one half and actually divided the community and completely destroyed what they had going on there. And these kind of unforeseen consequences are all too common in the area of foreign aid.
And Emery, how does the aid work once it does reach the members of the community?
How does aid work once it reaches the community? Okay, well, sometimes the aid is actually received well by the community and does manage to reach its correct destination. However, often the aid provides inconsequential and in many cases significantly decreases the economic prosperity in the community by replacing jobs with machines or investing money in businesses that are ultimately doomed to fail. For example, the makers of Tom shoes had the brilliant and selfless idea to donate shoes to children of third world countries whenever a shoe is bought normally. However, the shoes given actually take away from the shoe market in Africa, helping a small number of people individually, yes, but at the end of the day, they're really just harming the market and taking away from possible in-country shoe manufacturing jobs.
And what are the effects of governmental corruption on foreign aid?
How does governmental corruption affect foreign aid? Well, let me tell you. The major problem with international aid is its consolidation of the state and of the state domination in undeveloped society. Domination which is extraordinarily strong there even without our interference. Large share of aid resources are channeled through corrupted and incapable governments that are of underdeveloped countries that are constantly elevating both illegal corruption and corruption of the system of social and property relations, as well as preserving and supporting impotent governance by hampering, damaging, and sometimes even destroying any social and political opposition. And on top of that, relieving the government from any worries about economic situation and economic efficiency. All this wicked international support happens against interests of the people in undeveloped countries, further escalating poverty, starvation, desperation, and violation of human rights, owing to consolidation of repulsive societal regimes by means of international aid. Now that's what the Aid and International Relations has to say on this subject. But, talking with my dear friend Dambisa Moyo, author of the best-selling book Dead Aid, she told me that poverty is manifested not merely in low and inadequate incomes, low growth and limited job opportunities, but also in precisely those areas most crucial to aid effectiveness. Weak commitments, capacities and capabilities of governments, weak institutions, system and processes of governance and weak accountability, and limited abilities to draw up homegrown plans or programs and to implement them. The challenge is how to provide aid when the context is not just marginally suboptimal, but when the countries face a range of deep-seated and often interlinked systematic problems. Now, ultimately, what this boils down to is that by continually providing foreign aid without an intended stopping point, we are teaching these governments that foreign aid can be treated as an income and not as a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Dambisa suggests that by placing limitations on our aid commitments, then the receiving governments will be forced to plan ahead for their people and take responsibility for the problems, which will provide a much stronger solution than simply doling out money to governments in an attempt to give foreign aid.
Thank you, Emery, for coming on today and giving us that unique insight. It was a pleasure having you, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
No problem, Bo. Patani Buena. That means goodbye in Chichewa, the language of Malawi.
There you have it. Our analysts and correspondents have hopefully brought you new insights and perspectives regarding foreign aid. Though helpful in many ways, the realm of foreign aid is complex and oftentimes has unintended consequences. In the future, much needed reforms are required to effectively distribute resources and money to those in need. Be sure to stay tuned for our next program, and for all of us here on Global Trotters, have a wonderful evening.